Hi students, in this video we will talk about the main concepts that are a part of the life course perspective. There are 5 main concepts that make up the life course perspective, and those are cohorts, transitions, trajectories, life events, and turning points. We will take some time to talk about each one of these, and I will give you some examples and activities to reinforce what you are learning. So first we'll start with cohorts. Cohorts are groups of persons born during the same time period who experience particular social changes within a given culture in the same sequence and at the same age. So sometimes you'll hear this called a birth cohort because of the idea that these people are born during the same period of time. And because they're born at the same period of time, they will experience some of the same social changes because they are the same age when they experience those events, and they'll be at the same age when they experience those events. So you may be wondering, cohorts sound a lot like generations, right? So there is a slight difference between cohorts and generations, and this is the difference. For generations, they are typically about 20 years of a span. So from 1980 to 2000 could be a generation. Cohorts can be smaller subsets than 20 years. And then the key difference, though, is that a cohort remains a cohort until there is some sort of shared experience. So they have to share some sort of characteristics or behavior to be considered a generation. You can be born at the same time and be in the same cohort, but not be a part of a generation. So again, generations are birth cohorts that develop a shared sense of social history and identity. One thing to note is that there are disparities in cohort sizes that can determine educational and employment opportunities, as well as family life. One of the key examples of this is the differences between the baby boomers generation and the millennials. So your book talks quite a bit about this, and the baby boomers generation is called baby boom because their cohort is so large. After World War II, there were lots of babies made, and those babies are now older adults. For millennials, this is also a large group, and millennials actually have surpassed baby boomers in their size, the size of the cohort. But their educational and employment opportunities are very different than what the baby boomers entered into young adulthood with. So, for example, the economic situation is very different than when baby boomers were going through young adulthood, and um, there was lots of economic growth. Now, for millennials facing young adulthood, they did so in a recession, and there were less opportunities for things like buying a house. And that generation is also known to have lots of student debt that can impact their opportunities for building wealth. We use population pyramids to think about cohorts. We can use population pyramids to see at a given time in a given geographic location, usually, what the distribution of ages are among the population. So, how many babies are there versus older adults? Let's take a look at some. So there's several tools for population pyramids online, and I highly encourage you to play around with these. The links are provided for you on Moodle. I am going to spend a few minutes highlighting some key points by looking at this last link, Our World in Data, Age Structure. Okay, so this website will show you several different graphics that display age stratification in different ways. The one that I want us to take a minute to really look at is this weird looking picture. This graph is the demography of the world population from 1950, so the past, and all the way out projecting to the year 2100. And as you can see, over here, this is the age that people are, and this is is the time that goes by. And so you'll see that as you get um, to this point, this is when people are more likely to die. And so this is the distribution. You'll notice that we are growing. The population of the world is growing. If you look at how many people were on the earth in 1950 versus 2100, um, there's a huge crisis here. If this projection is true, how are we going to support? Sorry, there's a fly. How are we going to support that many people with the limited resources that we have? All right. Another important statistic is a sex ratio, which is the number of males per 100 females in the population. So we can know things by knowing that there is a low or high sex ratio. So for the low sex ratios, that means that there's fewer males compared to females. When there's a high sex ratio, that means that there's fewer females than males. And there's different explanations for this. So usually in history, when there are low sex ratios, there may be war going on. Traditionally, males are more likely to be in combat and more likely to die in combat. So that is one explanation for having a low sex ratio. Um, there are also explanations for high sex ratios. So when there are fewer females, we have to think about reasons that females would be more likely to die than males. One key example is childbirth. So especially in areas where there are high maternal mortality rates, you may also see high sex ratios. Another thing to consider when you see a country that has a high sex ratio is the societal views on women. So, some scholars suggest that a high sex ratio can be associated with discrimination and oppression of women. So, practices that would go along with those kind of views are abortion that is based on whether the baby is a girl or a boy, um, infanticide, so um, actually, the murder of babies and young children based on their whether they're male or female. All right. Now that we have talked about cohorts, we are going to move along and talk about transitions. Transitions are changes in roles and statuses that represent a distinct departure from prior roles and statuses. So, transitions are changes, and it's a change away from what has been the norm for a while. So, some examples of transitions would be one normal transition is whenever people enter young adulthood. So, it is, a time whenever people maybe in high school and are planning what kind of career they want, what kind of school they want to go, if they want to go to college. And they do all of these things to prepare, and all of those events tied together turn into a transition into adulthood. So there's not one key event that we can pinpoint, but a series of events together is a transition. And transitions can relate to family life. They can be marriages, births, divorces, remarriages, death. But also, transitions can happen in small groups, communities, and formal organizations. So, I want you to think for a minute, what would those transitions look like? On this Padlet exercise, I want you to share your ideas with your classmates. What are some examples of transitions? Think about your own experiences with small groups and communities and formal organizations. When have they experienced a transition? Um, I'll give you an example. One transition that is is happening in an organization that I am on the board is that we're in the process of hiring a new executive director. And so it's been a transition from to this point where we will have a new leader. Next concept, trajectories. So trajectories are relatively stable and they're also long term. So they're over time. They're processes and patterns of events that are involving multiple transitions. So just like we can put together events to turn into a transition, we can put together transitions to become trajectories, which is more of a long term pattern, whereas a transition is more short term. And a single life is made of multiple trajectories. So we usually think of trajectories topic wise. So you may have one trajectory for family life, you may have another type of trajectory for work life. So you could be very successful at work and have a different trajectory for your personal life. Trajectories are usually understood better in hindsight because that's when we can look back and say, oh, there's a pattern. Usually, when we're in the moment of experiencing events in our lives, it's harder to put those patterns together. So, generally, we look back on our trajectories. All right. To better understand trajectories, I am going to explain the results of a study that was done by Dr. Karen Derafinko and her colleagues on substance abuse trajectories. Addictions is a field that uses the life course perspective very often, especially the idea of trajectories. Many addiction scholars are interested in what are the things that change people's trajectories. And so in this article, the authors, the researchers, they studied college students and they asked them questions about their past drug use and their current drug use to create a predictive model of what their trajectory would look like of substance use throughout their life. So the basic idea is if they have used drugs early on, are they going to continue to use drugs? And what are the events that change those patterns? So they looked at three main groups. So they looked at alcohol, they looked at marijuana use, and then they looked at hard drug use. They defined hard drugs as basically anything that's not alcohol or marijuana. And so that includes things like cocaine and heroin, and literally any other drug. So the first one we'll look at is the alcohol trajectory. This is an image from their paper, which you can find the article on the Moodle course site. You're not required to read the whole thing, but you may find it interesting to go back and look at the article. Okay, alcohol trajectories. So you'll note over here in the legend that there are 5 groups. So there are the no to low drinkers, so people who don't drink at all or they drink very little. Group 2 is moderate drinkers. 3 is experimenters. So those are people who maybe tried it out when they're younger, but then don't really continue their use. Group 4 is late onset heavy drinkers. So they weren't really drinkers when they were young, but then there was some sort of change when they got older, which led them to be a heavy drinker. And then the last group is early onset heavy drinkers. And those are people who start drinking early and they continue to be heavy drinkers for their lifetimes. So let's take a look at this. So if you look at this, the low drinkers, they kind of stay steady over time. For the moderate drinkers, their use keeps climbing until college, and then that's kind of what their norm is for the time that they stay in college. The experimenters are the ones who are these triangles right here. So when they are in high school, they're experimenting, and then they continue in college, and then their use kind of starts going down. So they did a lot in the beginning, and they realize, oh, maybe this isn't for me, and it goes down. Then for the heavy drinkers, the late onset ones are in this X. So they did not start drinking until maybe 11th, 12th grade. And then after they start college, that is what marks a peak for them. They, continue to drink, and even though they are not drinking quite exponentially more, they're steadily increasing their use over time. Then for the early onset heavy drinkers, they have a similar pattern, but it's more exaggerated. So they, already started off in 7th grade, even maybe using alcohol. They have a really steep curve here until they peak at about 12th grade, beginning of college, and then it stays steady for the most part. So you can see that these are very different patterns of behavior, and there are likely events that are um, really important to the changes in this trajectory. And that'll be the next concept that we talk about is turning points. Let's look at the marijuana trajectories. So this one has similar groups. There's abstainers, occasional users, moderate users, and high users. Um, for the abstainers, they have a flat line because they've never used marijuana and they continue to never use marijuana the whole time that they're in college. The occasional users kind of have a similar pattern, but not nearly as exaggerated as the experimenters for the alcohol trajectory. And they just have a little bump, so maybe they tried it when they got to college and then their use went down. Then there are the moderate users, so they are ones who also are they're starting in high school though. They peak right at high school, and then it actually goes down a little bit in college. They continue their use on average, and it's generally steady throughout college. Then the high users, they found that really escalated their use during high school, and then mid high school is when it starts to come down. But still, you'll see that these high users are still using, and they're using considerably more than these other groups. Okay, now let's look at hard drugs. So for hard drugs, we have the same categories that we did for alcohol. And if you look here, let's look at the no to low users first. So you'll see that this pattern is very similar to the abstainers. So in the experimenters, where maybe there's a little boop late high school where they tried cocaine or once and then they stopped. They decided it wasn't for them. Okay, then, or they were able to stop. Then we get to the late onset heavy users, and usually this use starts around 11th, 12th grade, and that's when it starts, and then you see it kind of goes down a little bit, but then as they start getting closer to junior year, it goes up in the steady incline. So these are things and the patterns that you have to think about. Are there turning points here that change this trajectory? What's happening during 12th grade that makes people, lower their use? Or what makes them start their use? All right, life events. Life events are significant occurrences in a person's life that may produce serious and long lasting effects. So, when we think about life events, they are the causes, they're not the effects. Effects of a life event can be measured using scales. Usually, they're considered a stress rating. These are two different ones. One is in your textbook, this Holmes Ray life events inventory, and the life change index is another one. I encourage you guys to take a look at these and think about how impactful each of these life events can be on a person's perceived stress. So, life event inventories, like the one in your book, are usually skewed towards negative events. Um, it's just something to be aware of and is a criticism of life event inventories. So, scholars have really moved away from life event inventories, but have found that it's more useful to classify life events based on these different categories. Was it a major versus minor event? Was it anticipated versus unanticipated? Controllable versus uncontrollable? Typical versus atypical? Desirable versus undesirable? Or acute versus chronic? So I'll give you a few examples of these. So for anticipated versus unanticipated, you may think about the life event of the loss of a loved one. If it is unanticipated, it may have a much greater impact on a person's life than if it was expected or anticipated. Not saying that that takes away grief, it just makes it a different type of grief for anticipated versus unanticipated deaths. We can say the same thing about desirable versus undesirable. So there are life events that are happy stress, like getting married or having a baby. Those can oftentimes be considered desirable. And their effects will be a lot different than undesirable life effects. Um, and it doesn't mean that, and they'll have different impacts on that person over time. All right, finally, we're going to talk about the last concept, which is turning points. Turning points can be life events or transitions that produce a major change or a lasting shift in the trajectory. So, turning points can be events or they can be groups of events, which are transitions. Turning points can happen for individuals and for social systems. So there can be a turning point in a family, there can be a turning point for a group, an organization, just like when we talked um, about transitions. The idea of the turning point is what really sets the life course perspective from other traditional developmental theories, because traditional theories have usually posited that life trajectories are steady and they're moving and they're continuous, whereas the life course perspective is saying that, hey, we can have these turning points that change the trajectory. Turning points also don't have to be negative, so social work intervention is a turning point. So whenever social workers are able to intervene with someone, it could help them to change their lives for the better. Three types of events that can be turning points: ones that close or open opportunities, so maybe graduating from high school, graduating from college. They make a lasting change on the person's environment. So if we're using the graduation example, this is also a good candidate for a turning point, because maybe you would move to go to a new school or for a new job. You certainly are going to have a change in what you're doing every day, because you won't be going to school anymore. And you'll be going to a different place, a different environment. And then lastly, it should change a person's self-concept or beliefs or expectations. That is the key. That one is one that can be more internal too. So it may not be as obvious to other people that a turning point happened. Now let's talk about transitions and how transitions might become a turning point. So whenever transition is coupled with a crisis, it can be a turning point. Whenever it involves family conflict over the needs or the wants of the individual and the greater good of the family unit. If the transition is off time, so it doesn't happen at the traditional time or the normed time. So for example, failure to launch. So whenever someone does not leave their family of origin home until later than most people their age. And then whenever a transition is followed by negative consequences, that can be a turning point. And then also whenever it requires exceptional social adjustments, it can be a turning point. All right, that's the end of this micro lecture. If you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out.